The letter arrived on a Thursday, not a summons, not a request. A single sentence written in the Duke of Windermere's cold, precise hand, delivered to Lady Matilda's breakfast tray between her tea and her untouched toast. You will depart for Thornfield Park by Friday morning. Do not write to London. Do not expect a reply if you do. No explanation, no farewell. Just an address in the northernmost reaches of Yorkshire, so remote it appeared on no map she had ever studied, and the quiet, devastating certainty that her husband of 14 months had just erased her from his life as casually as a man blotting ink from a page. Matilda was 23 years old. She had been educated by a father who valued her mind precisely as long as it served his ambitions, married to a duke who valued her dowry precisely as long as it remained legally transferable, and she had spent 14 months inside a grand London townhouse, feeling like a very expensive piece of furniture that no one wished to sit on. She had attended 31 dinners, hosted 14 galas, smiled at every face her husband required her to smile at, and learned, with painstaking precision, to make herself invisible in the one environment where she should have been most visible. She had also spent those 14 months preparing for the moment he made a mistake. What the Duke did not know, what no one in London's glittering, gossip-hungry society knew, was that Matilda had been waiting for exactly this. The year was 1814, and the Regency's social season was at its most vicious. London burned bright with candlelight and whispered ambition. Fortunes were made at card tables and destroyed at breakfast, and no weapon was sharper or more freely wielded than a reputation. At the apex of this world stood Edmund Windermere, the 5th Duke of Windermere, a man so composed, so achingly correct in every manner, that society had long since stopped fearing him and simply accepted him as a fixed point around which lesser people orbited. He had married Matilda Hartwell for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with a document she was never meant to find. She had found it on their wedding night, tucked inside the spine of a legal folio left carelessly on his writing desk, the kind of carelessness only a man who never feared his wife's intelligence would commit, was a private agreement between the Duke and her father. Matilda's marriage was not a union. It was a transaction, structured to transfer control of the Hartwell Northern textile mills directly to the Windermere estate the moment she bore an heir. She was not a wife. She was a vessel with a dowry attached and a single biological function to perform. She had read it twice, folded it with steady hands, placed it back exactly as she had found it, and then she had begun to plan. She spent the following 14 months doing 3 things simultaneously, each hidden behind the performance of the perfectly unremarkable Duchess. She memorized every significant document that passed through Edmund's study, which she had volunteered to organize on the grounds that his filing system was, genuinely, a professional embarrassment. She cultivated a quiet, private correspondence with her father's estranged sister, a woman named Agnes Hartwell, who had vanished from the family record in 1808 under circumstances no one in polite company would discuss. And she educated herself, systematically and without drawing attention, in labor law, parliamentary procedure, and the mechanics of northern textile commerce, using the vast library her husband never once invited her to enter but also never thought to lock. There was one other thing she had noticed during those 14 months. A man who appeared with quiet regularity at Edmund's club dinners and occasionally at their table. Lord Hartley, whose family controlled 3 of the largest southern textile broker houses and who smiled at Matilda with the particular warmth of a man who found her unthreatening. She had catalogued him the way she catalogued everything, carefully, without revealing that she had. Edmund was not a cruel man. That was in some ways the most painful part. He was simply a man who had never once considered that the woman he had purchased might be worth the effort of actually seeing. Now, standing at the frost-edged window of her London bedroom, watching a footman load her trunks onto the carriage below, Matilda allowed herself the smallest, most dangerous smile. Edmund had banished her to Thornfield Park to silence her. He had sent her directly to the people she needed most. The carriage ride north took 2 full days, winding through moors so vast and colourless they seemed to belong to another century entirely. When the iron gates of Thornfield Park finally appeared through the frost-heavy mist, Matilda leaned forward and studied the estate with the quiet, assessing eye she had spent 14 months perfecting. The house was large, severe, and very much alive. Smoke curled from 4 chimneys. Lantern light moved behind the lower windows, and standing at the entrance, wrapped in a wool shawl the colour of coal, was a woman Matilda had not seen since she was 17 years old, in 1808. On the last occasion her father had allowed them to occupy the same room. Agnes Hartwell, her father's sister, the only blood relative who had ever spoken to her without an agenda attached. She was very much not dead. "The family declared you gone," Matilda said, stepping down from the carriage, her breath misting in the cold air. Agnes's expression carried the quality of a woman who has survived too much to spend warmth on ceremony. "Your father told anyone who inquired that I had died of fever in Bath," she said, taking Matilda's hands in both of hers. "It was considerably simpler than explaining why I refused to surrender the Hartwell workers' wage ledgers to the Windermere solicitors." She held Matilda's gaze without flinching. "He sent a land agent to remove me from this estate twice. The second time, I showed him a letter that gave me legal cause to involve a magistrate. He has not sent anyone since." She squeezed Matilda's hands once firmly. "Come inside. The fire is lit and there is a great deal you do not yet know." That night, seated beside a fire that crackled with genuine northern ferocity, Matilda learned the full shape of what had been done to her. The agreement she had found on her wedding night was only the first half of the contract. Agnes produced the second half from beneath a loose floorboard, its edges yellowed, its ink slightly different in character from the page Matilda had memorized. Written in a different hand, on a different day, slipped beneath the same witnessing signature as if it had always been there. Matilda read it once, then again. The secondary clause, buried beneath impenetrable legal language, stipulated that if Matilda died before producing an heir, the Hartwell mills transferred to the Windermere estate regardless, immediately, unconditionally. Her life, in the cold arithmetic of this document, had a precise commercial value and a built-in expiration condition. Two signatures witnessed it, her father's, and that of Edmund's personal solicitor, a man named Graves, who had held his position for over 20 years and whose name appeared on every significant Windermere legal instrument Matilda had spent 14 months memorizing. "Does Edmund know the second clause exists?" Matilda asked. Her voice was steady. Her hands, hidden in her lap, were not. Agnes regarded her with the careful patience of someone who understands the weight of the answer she is about to give. "That," she said quietly, "is the question everything else depends on." Matilda did not sleep that night. She lay in the unfamiliar bed and held the question still in her mind, turning it slowly, examining every face of it. Because if Edmund had known, if he had stood at the altar with full awareness that her death served him financially, then everything she had, quietly, stubbornly, against the better judgment of a woman who knew exactly what her marriage was, permitted herself to feel during 14 months of cold and distant cohabitation, needed to be reclassified as something far more dangerous than loneliness. But if he had not known, then someone else had engineered her destruction from within his own household, someone who still stood very close to her husband, someone who had not yet been given any reason to feel afraid. She thought of Lord Hartley's smile across the dinner table. Unthreatening, she had catalogued him. She revised the entry. By morning she had made her decision. She would not write desperate letters north to London to a man who had told her not to expect replies. She would not retreat to her father who had sold her. She would build something. Here on this frost-bitten estate at the edge of the known world, she would construct the instrument of her own vindication, quietly enough that by the time anyone in London thought to look north, there would be nothing left to dismantle. What Edmund did not understand about Thornfield Park, what no one in his London circle had thought to investigate, was that the estate sat at the precise geographic centre of 6 of the largest textile-producing villages in the north of England. The mill workers, the weavers, the women who ran the spinning frames from 4 in the morning until their hands shook, they all lived within 12 miles of these gates. And Agnes, in the 6 years since her disappearance from the family record, had been organising them with the patience and precision of someone who understood that lasting change requires infrastructure, not spectacle, not riot, not the kind of raw, visible rebellion that handed the government an excuse for cavalry and gave newspapers a reason to call it sedition. Agnes had built something the law had no clean mechanism to dismantle, a cooperative trade network operating entirely within legal bounds that allowed northern mill workers to sell finished goods directly to Scottish and Irish merchants, bypassing the southern broker houses that Edmund and men of his class, men like Lord Hartley, controlled absolutely, 3 years in development. 6 months from being large enough to functionally collapse the broker commission system, and missing one thing it could not build for itself. A name, a title, a face that could walk into a parliamentary lobby without being immediately escorted back out. Someone whose rank made her correspondence impossible to discard, whose address carried the kind of social weight that transformed petitions into policy someone like the Duchess of Windermere. Matilda stood in Agnes's kitchen on the second morning, reading 3 years of correspondence and ledgers with the focused intensity of a woman who had spent her entire marriage preparing for exactly this kind of work, and she felt something she had nearly forgotten the texture of. Certainty. If I attach my name to this, she said carefully, Edmund's solicitors will know within weeks. Yes, Agnes said. He will move to stop it. He will try, Agnes replied, setting down her cup. But to stop it publicly, he must publicly destroy his own wife. And the Duke of Windermere has never once done anything in public that he could not frame as measured, reasonable, and correct. Dismantling his own Duchess before Parliament and the northern press would be none of those things. Matilda thought of Edmund. His perfectly proportioned words at dinner. His absolute refusal to raise his voice, even on the one occasion she had thrown a book across the drawing room in pure frustrated desperation. She remembered his face in that moment with precise clarity. It had not been cold, it had not been contemptuous. It had been something she had spent 14 months trying to name. Something that lived in the space between regret and the stubborn refusal to examine what the regret was for. She set the memory aside. Fairness to him was a luxury she could not afford yet. The weeks that followed moved with the momentum of something that had been held back too long. Matilda travelled the villages with Agnes, sat in cold church halls, and listened to accounts that made the injustice of her own situation feel almost modest by comparison. Women working 16-hour days for wages that were docked for machine breakages they had not caused. Children employed as frame runners because their hands were small enough to reach the moving parts adults could not. A system so thoroughly embedded that the people inside it had nearly stopped imagining anything outside it. Nearly. That word, that fragile, stubborn nearly, was where Agnes had been working for 3 years. It was where Matilda went to work now. She had her father's facility with numbers and her mother's rare, genuine ability to make people feel considered rather than managed. Within a month, she had restructured 3 cooperative agreements, drafted a formal petition for parliamentary review of Northern Labour contracts, and written, under the pseudonym A Northern Lady of Station, a series of open letters to the Leeds Intelligencer arguing that the broker commission system constituted an unlawful restraint of northern trade. The letters moved with a velocity that surprised even Agnes, reprinted in 2 Edinburgh papers, debated in a Manchester counting house, reportedly read aloud in at least 1 London drawing room before anyone thought to ask who had written them. Lord Hartley, whose family's broker houses stood to lose the most if the petition reached Parliament, found out who had written them in less than a fortnight. He was methodical and he was well connected, and he did not bring the information to Edmund directly, because a direct approach would have required Edmund to confront his wife with evidence and hear her response. Instead, Hartley raised it over port at Edmund's club, in the company of men whose opinion the Duke valued, framing it not as a commercial threat but as a personal betrayal. The Duchess of Windermere, he suggested with the practiced sorrow of a man who hated to be the bearer of such news, had been feeding sensitive information about the Duke's northern business interests to Agnes Hartwell and using it to orchestrate a public attack on holdings connected to the Windermere estate. It was a precise, elegant lie. It took Matilda's agency and reframed it as treachery. It reached Edmund at exactly the moment he was least equipped to question it, surrounded by men he trusted, without his wife present to say a single word in her own defense. The banishment letter was written that same evening. Matilda had not known this sequence of events yet. She was about to. The revelation came in the form of a misdelivered letter. It arrived at the main house addressed to Agnes but intended for a different recipient, carried by a young rider who did not yet know the estate well enough to distinguish the main house from the cottage. Agnes brought it to Matilda without opening it, her expression carrying the gravity of someone who has learned to recognize significance before she fully understands its shape. It was from Graves, not addressed to Edmund, addressed to Lord Philip Windermere, Edmund's younger brother, whose gambling debts had grown to a figure that transformed inheritance from a distant comfort into an immediate necessity. Matilda read it standing at the kitchen table. She did not sit down. She did not speak for a long time after finishing it. The letter was a progress report. In it, Graves confirmed that the second clause of the marriage contract, the one that triggered the Hartwell mill transfer upon Matilda's death, had been successfully inserted into the witnessed document after Edmund's signature during the processing stage when only Graves had custody of the final instrument. Edmund had signed the original agreement. The altered version, with Matilda's life priced into it, had been substituted during witnessing. Philip had commissioned it 2 weeks before the wedding. Graves had executed it, and for 14 months, both men had been waiting with different degrees of patience for circumstance or misfortune to do what they could not do directly. Edmund had not known. She stood at the window for a long time. The fire behind her crackled. The moors stretched out, grey and enormous and indifferent to the complications of human beings. Agnes waited without speaking, which was the most generous thing she could have offered. He had not known. He had married her transactionally, with a coldness toward her personhood that she would not excuse or diminish. But he had not married her as a man who had calculated the value of her death. The architecture of the monster she had been constructing her fury around was wrong. He was something more frustrating and more human, a man capable of serious harm through arrogance and inattention, who had also been deceived by someone he trusted inside his own household. She thought again of Edmund's face across the drawing room, the expression she had spent 14 months failing to name. It had been shame. It had always been shame. A man who knew, on some inarticulate level, that the terms of the life he had built were wrong, and who had never once developed the courage or the vocabulary to do anything about it. She thought of Lord Hartley's smile, unthreatening. She thought of Philip, who had sat at their wedding breakfast, and raised a glass and looked her in the eye while the altered claws sat drying in. Graves's office. She folded the letter, placed it in the inside pocket of her dress, against her ribs, where she would feel it. Then she went back to work. Edmund arrived at Thornfield Park 19 days later. He came on horseback without a carriage or a valet, his coat grey with road dust, his face carrying the specific exhaustion of a man who has not slept soundly since making a decision he cannot reverse, and cannot stop examining. He had ridden 2 full days from London. Matilda noted that without expression, but she noted it. She received him in the main hall. The cooperative ledgers sat on the side table in plain view. The petition draft was beside them. She did not move either. He looked at her for a moment, then at the room. The maps on the wall, the stacked correspondence, the evidence of weeks of concentrated and purposeful work. Something crossed his face that was not the composed authority he wore in London like a second skin. It was rawer than that, considerably less comfortable for him. "I owe you an explanation before I say anything else," he said. "You owe me several," Matilda replied. "Begin with the one that explains why you issued a banishment on the word of a man with a financial interest, in my silence, without asking me directly whether his account was true." Edmund held her gaze without deflecting. "Because I was in a room full of men whose judgment I have relied on for 20 years, and I acted on what they told me before I had the decency to seek yours." He stopped. When he continued, his voice was quieter. "I established within 4 days that Hartley had fabricated the accusation. He has held a commercial interest in suppressing the cooperative petition from its inception. I knew within 4 days that I had been wrong. He did not look away. I did not know how to recall the letter. I told myself it was because doing so would appear weak. The truth was simpler and worse than that. I was ashamed of what I had done, and I did not know how to begin to address it." "So you left me in Yorkshire," Matilda said, not as an accusation, as a fact she was placing on the table between them, where it needed to sit. Yes, the silence that followed was not the silence of 2 people waiting for the other to soften. It was the silence of 2 people standing in the unromantic full light of what their situation actually was, with no social performance available to ease it. Matilda let it sit for a long moment, then she spoke. "I am not ready to move past what has been done," she said clearly. "Not the marriage contract, not the banishment, not 14 months of being invisible inside my own home. I am telling you that honestly, because I think you have had enough of people who speak to you carefully rather than truthfully." Edmund absorbed this without deflecting from it. "That is fair. I also know about Graves," Matilda continued, "and about your brother. I have the letter." She watched something move through Edmund's expression that she had never seen there before. Not shame this time. Something closer to the specific devastation of a man who has just understood that the betrayal he is being told about was conducted by someone who sat at his table and looked him in the eye for 20 years. He did not speak for a moment. "Graves was dismissed by messenger this morning," he said finally. "I rode here before dealing with Philip because I needed to understand what I was dealing with Philip for." "Then I will tell you," Matilda said. "You are dealing with him for this." She crossed to the table, opened the leather folio that sat beside the ledgers, and placed the altered contract in front of him. The second clause, the inserted page, the different ink, all of it. Edmund read it standing up. He did not move for a long time after finishing. When he finally looked up, the face of the 5th Duke of Windermere, the man society had long since stopped fearing and simply accepted as a fixed point, was entirely unguarded. Whatever he had suspected about Philip's debts and Graves's loyalties, the full written evidence of what they had constructed around his wife was something else, something that could not be reasoned into a manageable shape. "He was at our wedding breakfast," Edmund said quietly. "Yes," Matilda said he was. The silence after that one was different. It had weight. Matilda was the one who broke it, and she did so deliberately, because she had not come this far to let the conversation collapse into the easier territory of shared outrage. There was work still to do, and she intended to do it. "Philip will retire from London without scandal, and without positioning himself as a victim," she said. "I want it arranged in a way that carries sufficient private consequence that he understands the full cost of what he commissioned. I will leave the specifics of that to you, but I will know if it is done incorrectly." Edmund nodded. "It will be done correctly. Lord Hartley," Matilda continued, "I will manage myself. I have what I need." Edmund looked at her steadily. "What do you need from me?" "The cooperative petition goes to Parliament under your name and your seat," she said. "Not as an act of marital management or a husband defending an errant wife's project. As the Duke of Windermere, who has reviewed the conditions of the northern mills connected to his own estate and found them demanding urgent parliamentary remedy. You will present it as your own conviction, because by the time I am finished explaining it to you, it will be." Something shifted in Edmund's expression. Not quite the admiration of a man who has underestimated someone and is now recalibrating. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, if she was honest, like the specific relief of a man who has been a fixed point for so long that he had forgotten fixed points are not required to be correct. "And between us," Matilda said, her voice neither soft nor hard but simply exact, "I am not a transaction. I am not a silence to be managed when it becomes inconvenient. I am the Duchess of Windermere, and from this point forward, that title will mean something in this country that it did not mean before I arrived at this estate in a carriage I did not choose, to a house I had never seen, because a man I had not wronged decided I was easier to remove than to address." Edmund was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, there was no qualification in it, no careful framing, no diplomatic softening. "Yes," he said. "It will. It was not love yet. It might not be love for a long time if it became that at all. There were too many unpaid debts between them for what existed now to carry that name honestly. But it was something more durable than a forced peace, and more honest than a performance of reconciliation. It was two people renegotiating the terms of a life that had been built wrong, with the full knowledge of what it had cost them both to arrive at the table. And that, for now, was enough to build from. The cooperative petition reached the floor of the House of Lords in the spring of 1815, presented by the Duke of Windermere with the Northern Labour Network's full documentation appended. It did not pass on its first reading. Rarely does anything that threatens entrenched money pass on its first reading. But it was debated for 4 hours. It was reported in the Times. It was reprinted in full in the Leeds Intelligencer, and in 6 villages north of Thornfield Park, mill workers who had never in their lives heard a peer of the realm speak their working conditions aloud on a parliamentary record, read the transcripts in relay, passing the pages from hand to hand until the paper fell apart at the creases. Lord Hartley's broker network began losing northern contracts within 3 months. By summer, 2 of his 3 houses had absorbed losses significant enough to require restructuring. He did not publicly connect this to the Duchess of Windermere, because doing so would have required him to explain, in precise detail, the nature of his prior interference. He said nothing. Matilda had known he would say nothing. She had constructed it that way. Lord Philip Windermere's retirement from London society was the subject of considerable speculation for approximately 2 weeks before something newer and louder replaced it in the drawing rooms. Those who pressed for an explanation were told that his health had required a quieter life in Somerset. Those who knew Edmund well enough to press him directly received a look that ended the conversation without requiring a word. Philip himself was not heard from in the clubs or lobbies or card rooms again. He had received, through his brother, a private communication whose contents remained undisclosed and whose effect was permanent. Whatever Edmund had said to him in that room, he had said it correctly. Agnes Hartwell was formally appointed Estate Director of Thornfield Park, a title that carried a salary, full legal standing on the household register, and the particular satisfaction of having outlasted every man who had ever attempted to erase her. She held the position for 22 years, and Matilda, the Duchess of Windermere, returned to London in the autumn of 1815. Not as the quiet, careful woman who had stepped onto a northbound carriage with one suitcase and a husband's dismissal resting on her breakfast tray. She returned as someone London found considerably more difficult to manage, significantly harder to ignore, and entirely impossible to reduce back to the dimensions they had previously assigned her. She had been sent to the wilderness to disappear. She had used it to build the beginning of something that would take years to complete, and that would carry her name long after every man who had underestimated her had been reduced to a minor entry in someone else's historical record. She had been handed exile and returned with infrastructure. She had been given silence and produced legislation. She had been told, in the language of a single cold sentence on a Thursday morning, that she did not matter. The answer to that sentence was still being written, and it was, by every available measure, magnificent. If Matilda's story stayed with you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more stories about the women who were underestimated exactly once.